I'm very excited to moderate our next panel. Thank you, Michael, for that enlightening talk to set the stage here. We have a wealth of knowledge up here, and we have 4 panelists from very different backgrounds, yet I think they're all linked by their desire to encourage private markets to make some meaningful investments into conservation finance. And in our 30-minute session today, we're going to try to address some of the different mechanisms, some were touched on already a little bit by Michael, that are going to help stimulate capital going into these sectors of ecosystem services and conservation. So let me just begin by introducing our panelists. We've got Joshua Bishop, National Manager of Markets, Sustainability and Business Partnerships, WWF Australia. Joshua is a natural resource and environmental economist with over 20 years of experience. Dr. Bishop manages WWF Australia's portfolio of corporate partnerships and engages with resource management leaders to drive demand for sustainability price commodities. His first degree was in literature and philosophy, so I hear, but that was a bit too abstract, so he joined the Peace Corps in Africa. Next, we've got Richard Burrett. Richard's a partner at Earth Capital Partners, also a fellow of the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. Richard's had about 25 years of experience, 30 years in international banking, 20 of those years at ABN AMRO. He developed extensive experience he has an experience of project and structured finance, but he was very instrumental in the creation of the Equator Principles. And that's a market-recognized standard for managing environmental and social risk issues in project financing. His first degree was in German literature. You can have a conversation with some of our members of the audience, I think. They'll test your German. And unrelated to that, his father was a professional rose gardener. Next, we have Harris Sherman. Harris is currently senior counsel at Arnold and Porter. He represents clients in a wide range of natural resource issues, including energy, water development, water quality, public lands, Native American projects, forestry, and agriculture. Mr. Sherman served as Undersecretary for Natural Resources and the Environment for the U.S. Department of Agriculture from 2009 to 2013. He oversaw the entire U.S. Forest Service and Natural Resources Conservation Service. And would you know, Harris is a fiddle player. And I hear we might put this up later at our party this evening. He recently played with Chuck LaBelle, who's keyboardist of the Rolling Stones. So we have a bit of a rock star. And next we have Brian Schillinglaw. My colleague Brian, Director of Investment and Operations at New Forest in our San Francisco office. He leads New Forest's carbon forestry investment strategies, including the development of our U.S. carbon forestry investment program and management of Forest Carbon Partners investment program. And a little known fact, because it's hard to get deep, dark secrets out of Brian, but he grew up an hour away from me in upstate New York, in Corning. And you, and Ithaca. So we've got a very diverse panel with, a 1 hour radius of each other at some point in our life. To start off our discussion, hope you don't mind if I stand, I feel very authoritative. Joshua, I'll start with you.
Go for it.
So WWF has been very active in engaging with business and thinking about different models to orient private capital towards funding for conservation. So if you could talk a little bit about how WWF sees the balance between production and conservation, but more, how do we fund that?
Thanks, Sarah. I'll talk a little bit of a story to begin with, how I got here. I have spent a lot of time in this field. I started off valuing forest environmental benefits, carbon, biodiversity, water, pollination, all the rest of it. And then I got interested in how do you turn those values into cash flow, because I was doing it as a kind of NGO academic exercise, and got interested in payments for ecosystem services and markets for ecosystem services, and worked a little bit on forest carbon finance, developing a standard for mangrove restoration as a means of generating carbon credits and investment into mangrove restoration. Got involved in the business and biodiversity offsets program with Michael and his colleagues. And I was frustrated at the pace at which these environmental markets were growing. And so I thought, I'll go back to school. And the way I'll do that is learn about what I see as an environmental market that has maybe been around longer and made more gains, and that's the whole certification side of things. Sustainable production, certification and labeling of commodities, forest commodities, but also agricultural commodities, seafood, and you're seeing proliferation in other sectors. And so I joined WWF because it's a leading organization in this space on certification, voluntary standards, and sustainable production. And I've learned a bit in the 4 years I've been here in Australia. And we work across beef, sugar, forest products, palm oil as an import, and seafood, a lot of work there, a little bit on sustainable finance. But I've learned a little bit. And one of the things I think WWF has learned, and maybe me too, is that you can get a fair amount of money out of the big companies on a purely philanthropic basis, but in the larger scheme of things, it's trivial. You know, we can get money for conservation projects, orangutan habitat restoration, marine conservation, you know, a few 100,000, maybe a few million over a couple of years here in Australia, drop in the bucket. But where the companies will spend quite a bit more, orders of magnitude more, is cleaning up their supply chains. And in particular, the big brands, whether that's you know, Kimberly-Clark, Unilever, Coca-Cola, McDonald's, or here in Australia, household names like Coles, Bunnings, Officeworks. These companies have reputations to defend, they have brands to build, and they will spend and invest substantially in those brands, including by cleaning up their supply chains. And that's where we've been able to get quite some progress. And they value the partnerships with NGOs like WWF and the certification systems like FSC, because for the credibility that supplies is a defense against reputational risk in their supply chains. I think that works, right? We've seen that works, and the scale is, it's not overwhelming, but it's significant. We're around about 15% of global forest products certified by FSC. If you add PEFC, which WWF doesn't endorse, you maybe double that. In palm oil, you're again looking well over 15% of total global production. It does work, but we're starting to plateau, right? We're reaching a kind of leveling off. And the question is, okay, what do you do about the other 80%? And so there's lots of room for growth, but how do we get that growth? And so we're looking at things like jurisdictional approaches, right? Instead of a proliferation of standards, how do we get an umbrella standard for agricultural commodities, for example? How do we certify a landscape or a state or a catchment? We're looking at more tiered standards. So how do you make the on-ramp easier so that companies can start with relatively digestible commitments and then move up the scale instead of a one-size-fits-all single bar you have to get over? And in palm oil, you've got the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil, and people talk about RSPO Plus or as an option to try and get a continuous improvement and rising ambition. And we're looking at things that reduce the cost. So again, in palm oil markets, we've had good success with what's called book and claim or green palm as a way of avoiding all the elaborate chain of custody measures, which are extremely costly. To try and get finance going directly from the buyers of a product to the plantation owner on the ground. A little bit controversial, like offsets were originally, but hopefully that's a model that can apply and is being applied in sugar markets and potentially in other commodity markets. So I think there are opportunities. I'll come back to some of the questions about how do you go beyond certification to finance for pure conservation, but may come back to that later.
Sure,
Thanks.
thank you. You touched on an issue about reputation and how that's driving some of these companies to make a difference in their supply chain, and I'm not sure if that's exactly what's driving large finance corporations such as banks, but I think it might be part of it. And I'll just hand over to you, Richard. You've been active, as I said, in the establishment of the Equator Principles. You're now at Earth Capital. You work a lot around environmental investments. And how do you see the role of banks potentially transforming the way that we finance business?
Maybe I should start off by saying actually a knowledge of fiction really helped me in my career as a banker in many of the projects I assessed. But Bankers don't wake up in the morning thinking, I'll go and damage and degrade natural pristine forestry or biodiversity today, believe it or not. But the reality is they do, and it's often the unconsidered consequences of the businesses and the projects they finance that cause that damage. We have to make decisions about whether we finance company A or company B, and if we finance company B, then society gets more company B. That's the supply of capital. And if company B has negative outcomes for society, then that's the society we end up with. So it was interesting at the Rio summit that the tagline was financing the future we want. We have to decide how we deploy capital into society, into the economy, because that will create what we end up with. And you can't be a successful bank in the long term in an unsuccessful, failing society. And we know what the threats are, both societally and ecologically. There are two broad things that banks have to do. The first is clearly they have to be far more proactive in financing the transition to a low-carbon, sustainable economy. UNEP would describe that as the green economy. They calculated that around 2% of global GDP has to be focused per annum over the next decades to invest in green infrastructure and activity. But it's got to be more than that. You can't just do that. You've also got to rigorously apply environmental, social, and governance thinking into how you make decisions on lending and investments. That's the bulk of your business. So I get a little worried when somebody says, yeah, we're going to double our sustainable investment portfolio. What are you going to do with the other 98% of your portfolios? We have sustainable investments over there, and we have the rest of our business over there. The first could be described as a do-good agenda, and it's about financing change. But the second, implementing ESG criteria, is that do less harm agenda. And it's really about changing finance to make sure that they understand the dependencies and the risks around natural capital. I'll give you a couple of examples that relate to conservation finance. One of the things we did at Rio, I was co-chair of UNEP Finance Initiative. We launched the Natural Capital Declaration, which has financial institution members. And one of the things they're looking at is how do you integrate natural capital criteria into decision making, really understanding the dependencies that businesses have on natural capital and the impacts of those businesses. The second initiative is something we're working on at Cambridge, in fact, together with WWF, the Banking and Environment Initiative. How do you get a group of investment bankers into the room? Well, you tell them their leading clients are going to be there. So we're working with the Consumer Goods Forum, the likes of Unilever, etc. And a compact has been signed to try and help the Consumer Goods Forum meet their 2020 target for zero net deforestation. Why is it a 2020 target? Because it's a challenging thing, and I don't think they know actually how to fully achieve it yet. But it's talking about eradicating deforestation on a net basis from their supply chains. So this soft commodity compact has now got 10 members, and they've identified the key causes of deforestation around forest, palm oil, soy, and beef production, and therefore they're going to try and embed the certification standards around those, so FSC, RSPO, etc., in the way they make lending decisions by 2020 to try and support that industry sector initiative. So that, again, is a sort of changing finance agenda, but the financing change part is they're also going to start looking at how they can finance the transformation of those companies' supply chains. So they've recently launched the Sustainable Letter of Credit product, which is interesting because those 10 banks account for around 50% of global trade finance. So hopefully that could make a change.
Thank you, Richard. Those initiatives that you mentioned, Natural Capital Declaration, Consumer Goods Forum, Soft Commodities Compact, and Sustainable Letter of Credit, it reminds me of something Michael said earlier about Be Bold, and these are initiatives that are doing that and are financing the future that they want. So I guess it's how to include the rest of the world in that slowly but surely. And about being bold, I don't know if people associate government regulations with being bold, but I think that Harris has some examples of things that have happened, at least in the US, around government regulations that have helped push private markets to consider these issues a bit more closely. So I was wondering if you could touch a little bit on, finance and agriculture, forestry, land management, and what have you found to be successful in terms of government intervention and what has been less successful?
Thank you, Sarah. Maybe I should just start out by saying, I guess what I bring is a perspective to some extent of a former government regulator. And just as a very broad statement, I mean, if you're asked to run a large government regulatory program, obviously your goal is to protect the environment, to come up with programs which are sustainable, and importantly also to try to figure out avenues or approaches which will help to build the economy in which you are operating. So, that's the general template, and I have to say, historically, and it's an environment I think most regulators, at least in the United States, grew up in. We grew up in this command and control environment. You may remember the 1970s. We had the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, the Drinking Water Act, so forth. So that's the framework which most government regulators grew up in. And those programs actually have done a lot of good for the United States. They've added a lot to conservation and environmental quality. Also, the government has had these very, in certain cases, robust programs of providing funding in terms of grants, technical assistance to advance conservation. That has worked over the years, and occasionally we have tax-related incentive programs such as conservation easements, which do a lot to further conservation goals. But I think it's useful to say that in the last decade or so, some of these systems, they're not breaking down, but they're not delivering the services that we had hoped that they would. And so you see in many agencies, at least in the United States, you see static or declining budgets. Number two, you see very significant challenges with climate change which are occurring. A graphic example of this, I headed up the U.S. Forest Service. The U.S. Forest Service oversees 8% of the land mass of the United States. In 1994, the U.S. Forest Service spent 14% of its budget on firefighting. This year, 2015, the Forest Service will spend over 60% of its budget on firefighting. And you can imagine that all of these other programs that are so critical to healthy forests, to protecting all those other values we've talked about, are kind of put aside because we have no choice other than to fight and suppress fires. So we are starting to look at new approaches, new avenues to deal with issues. And one of the areas that we have been dealing with is the advent of environmental markets. In 2008, we had a farm bill in the United States that created, for the first time I'm aware of anywhere on the planet, an Office of Environmental Markets. Sally Collins is here. She was our first director. And this office was located in the Department of Agriculture, in my section of the Department of Agriculture. And we spent several years initially looking at metrics, tools, evaluations, verification systems, how do you set up a marketplace, and we have, I think, gotten a pretty good grasp on the general metrics of what you do. And by the way, these materials are available for any of you who want to get them online. But in addition to that, and it was important, we started to work on pilots, and we have come up with some really exciting pilots. If we had time today, I could tell you about some of them, but they're innovative, they're win-win situations, they're perfect examples of how you bring these different constituencies together, and everybody can gain, everybody can make a little bit of money, the government can supplement their budgets. It's been very exciting, but we have to now take that to scale. And that's been our problem, because we're great at random acts of conservation, but we're terrible at sustained, global system-wide efforts in conservation. So we've been working on that. A couple very brief success stories. The United States Forest Service In our national planning rule, we have now a provision in our national planning rule which applies to every forest in the United States, public forest, that you must consider as a manager environmental markets. What are the possibilities? What are the opportunities? What are the partnerships you could bring together? And the White House as recently as, I think, a month ago, came out with a new guidance for every department of the federal government to start thinking about these sustainability environmental market opportunities. We have a conservation innovative grant program through the Natural Resources Conservation Service where we have given out 65 grants, and these are significant grants. They're probably in the range of $1 million or less, but 65 grants to private entities around the United States. They might be NGOs, they might be businesses, companies, what have you, to help them develop tools to deal with conservation finance. So I'm optimistic about this. The one area I just want to close with, which I find fascinating as a former regulator, when regulators sit down to promulgate regulations, they're not thinking about conservation finance. They're not thinking about environmental markets. They're creating regulatory systems, but they don't understand what the potential of these systems are to create a whole new set of opportunities that we could have out there to scale up these conservation efforts that we need to do. So that's a frontier that hopefully we're going to be addressing as well. Thanks.
Great, thank you very much, Harris. And I think that leads us nicely into our next topic, which is around a regulatory environment that is working. You mentioned getting up to scale. I think that we are starting to get there in the United States with what's happening in the California carbon market. Brian, I'll turn to you, and you've been a leading project developer in the California carbon offset regime. So it seems to be actually working versus some of these other carbon management schemes that haven't worked so well. And I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of your ideas around why that is.
Sure. Thanks, Sarah. You know, we've chatted a lot about ecosystem service markets today, and I'll take 4 minutes or 5 minutes to really dive into the California market and why it is getting to scale, and simultaneously keeping my colleague Nick awake. And so the California carbon market is the first time there has been a price signal at scale for increasing carbon storage in forests. And it is driving a material change in forest economics in the United States. And so the way this works is that California passed a law to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. That is partly being accomplished by an emissions trading system where all of the major polluters in California have to have a permit or an offset for every ton of pollution they emit. The permits are auctioned in limited and declining supply at a price, a minimum price that goes up at 5% real per annum. And that is driving investment in emissions reductions, including in offset projects. And it's creating demand for 150 to 200 million offsets through 2020, which is a market size of approximately $1.5 to $3 billion. Now, over 10 years ago, our CEO, Dave Brand, worked with a committee of NGO stakeholders, industry stakeholders, and academics to draft the first version of the Forest Carbon Offset Protocol that was eventually adopted many years later by the state of California in 2011 as a regulation. And now forests are the largest source of supply of offsets in the system, and New Forests is a leading supplier in that market with over 3 million offsets transacted, 2 million delivered, 150,000 hectares of natural forest registered in the system or in development, and all while delivering top decile returns to our clients. Now, what's remarkable about this system is that by the end of this year, we'll have reached approximately 2 million acres of forest land in the US that is either enrolled or in the process of enrolling in the system, which is almost over a 3% market penetration of the entire US private institutional timberland ownership a few years after the commencement of the system. So we could very well, within 10 or 15 years, be at somewhere between a 15 to 30% share of the entire investable US timberland base participating in this system. And that's a real success story. And the reason why this system has been successful, where other schemes to integrate forests into carbon pollution reduction schemes have been less successful, is the system uses an objective performance standard to quantify the offsets that are issued for actions taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It uses an average baseline for a given forest type, and if you're above that, and you commit to maintaining the inventory that you have above that baseline to carbon storage or part of it, you can realize a significant near-term material revenue from those carbon offsets. And so I think there's 3 lessons that we can draw from this. The first is that for ecosystem markets to scale, you do need a regulatory cap on pollution that drives demand for mitigation. You need sustained, in-depth, and of a long time duration engagement by the private sector and NGOs to really build rules of the road that actually work as partners with government that are going to scale appropriately. And the third is that these systems can scale best when they're giving credit for past good management, rather than assuming that management will continue simply because it has for a period of time, enabling people to monetize that in the way that this system enables people to monetize past conservative forest management and essentially get paid for inventory growth. And so, in conclusion, the California carbon market is one of the first carbon markets to scale in terms of a natural resource impact, and it's creating material, it's resegmenting the US timberland market and creating material opportunities both for current forest landowners and investors.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks very much. We have about 5 minutes left. I have a few more questions, but I realize these are amazing individuals, and you all might have some questions for them as well. If not, we'll continue on. But do we have any questions that come off? Yes, Yost Lemons in the back. We are getting our microphones for you momentarily. Thank you, Maria. Just in the back in the middle.
Yeah, hello. As a representative of the investor who recently announced that they would double their high sustainable investments, I have a reaction to what Richard said. For starters, we are talking here about tens of billions of euros, right? Not Aussie dollars, euros. This will have a far, far greater impact than any philanthropical millions or hundreds of thousands or have much bigger impact than regulatory markets, which we do not believe in, by the way. And it's not only that, it is only the high sustainability investments that are going to double. And that are investments with clear sustainable characteristics. For the remainder of our portfolio, which is not the remaining 98%, but far less. For instance, for the 4,000 companies we invest in, lots of them will no longer be eligible. So they will have to apply for the privilege to be in our portfolio, basically. And they can only do that by, with complying to certain rigorous standards. So I think what we are doing as a 360 billion euro investor has a far greater impact, is far more important than all the small fries, what's happening. And it hopefully will have an oil spill effect. Bit of bad word here in this context, but I believe in that. And don't dismiss it, please, because this is going to have a big impact.
Can I just say, you are the exception rather than the rule, and you're doing two things. You're increasing your sustainable investments, but you're also doing the other thing I said, which is ESG assessment of the rest of your portfolio. There are far too many financial institutions who do not necessarily do the latter. And the comment was directed at them rather than your upstanding institution. It belongs-
Finally, some recognition here.
Yeah,
We applaud what you're doing, and ideally other institutions will be following your lead.
Does anyone else on the panel want to react to that, or does anyone else dare ask a question? Joshua.
I didn't have another question, but since I've got the mic, I think Harris and Brian have showed what can happen when you have an enlightened regulator, and that trigger is important and needed. But that isn't going to help with some of these global public goods that we've got to deal with. And carbon, we've seen in the run-up to Paris just how hard it is. And biodiversity is even decades behind. So that's where I think the private sector and voluntary initiatives do have a role, and investors have a role in changing the norms and the expectations, so that investment is, not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative, and biodiversity positive, not biodiversity neutral. We need to be much more ambitious about our expectations from the business community, and we need to show some leadership and not wait for governments to reach a multilateral binding agreement, which they may never do.
True. We'll see what happens in Paris. Please join me in thanking our panel today.